All right, I think we'll make a start. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting both scholars and practitioners to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, we will be focusing on the U.S. as the global policeman, past, present, and future. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Stuart Schrader to the seminar series. I think it was in late 2019 that I received an email totally out of the blue from the editor of International Politics Reviews asking me to review Dr. Schrader's book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, which was published by the University of California Press. Actually, this was part of a roundtable of academics reviewing the book, and to have what essentially amounted to a special issue dedicated to reviewing one's first book, that I think is a reflection of the importance not only of the topic, but of the quality of the scholarship. And I, for one, can definitely recommend the book. Prior to reading it, I dealt a bit with sort of the history of U.S. police programs and U.S. foreign policy, especially during the Kennedy administration, and was a big fan of Costa Gavras's film, State of Siege, which dealt with the Dan Mitrione affair in Uruguay, but I never really considered the domestic boomerang effect, to use Hannah Arendt's phrase, of these programs, which is a topic Dr. Schrader addresses in his book. And his book has really set the standard in terms of academic scholarship on the topic. Of course, Dr. Schrader's book, in addition to addressing a fascinating topic in its own right, was also published just prior to the Black Lives Matter protests, the Portland protests, and so forth, when the topic of the militarization of U.S. police forces suddenly became a topic of central concern. And therefore, among the reasons why I'm so looking forward to Dr. Schrader's presentation is that all too often we think about U.S. foreign policy as what happens outside the United States, not about the unintended domestic effects as well. And therefore, to gain a holistic understanding of the topic, one needs to address both issues. Just to give a bit of background, Dr. Schrader is the Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University, having received his PhD in American Studies from New York University in 2015. He's been very busy indeed these past 5+ years, not only working at Johns Hopkins, but also as a fellow at Harvard. In fact, when reviewing his CV, I was amazed at the chest full of fellowships and grants that he's been associated with over the last years, including one he is currently working on entitled Inheritance Baltimore, Humanities and Arts Education for Black Liberation, Just Futures. But in addition to his academic work, I think Dr. Schrader can also be described as a public intellectual, particularly since the events of last year. He's been much in demand, and I greatly appreciate his participating in tonight's seminar. So Dr. Schrader, welcome to eBay, and I look forward to your presentation. Before I turn over the floor to you, and as my colleague loads up your presentation, I just mentioned to our participants that if you have any questions, you'll need to enter them into the chat box. And I would ask that if you do have any questions, to also identify your name and any affiliation. So Dr. Schrader, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really grateful to be here with all of you today. And of course, I'd especially like to thank Jeffrey Michaels for this invitation. His own research was actually very crucial for the work I've done, and I'm very pleased to continue our dialogue. So as Jeffrey said, my book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, came out in 2019. And the book focuses on the 3 decades or so after the end of World War II. And so what I'm going to do today is extend that analysis both backward and forward, which I've been trying to do in some subsequent research. I hope to illustrate an uninterrupted, though not unchanged, global policing mission for the United States over the course of the 20th century up to the present. And I hope I can put on the table a question of whether this mission, as we've understood it, will continue into the future. Now, usually when I'm talking to an audience about this material, I ask for a show of hands of who has heard the term global policeman. Unfortunately, I can't see you, so I'll just assume that you're all raising your hands and saying that you have heard this term. And I'd certainly be interested to hear from all of you how this framework resonates in Spain, of course, given that the United States first assumed the role, arguably, of global policeman by annexing what had been Spanish colonies. So I will make a relatively straightforward argument to you today, which goes as follows. The United States played the role of the global policeman by relying on the globalization of its police officers. The global policeman needed global policemen and eventually global policewomen. US global power, of course, has multiple dimensions, but I want to emphasize the practical ways that the United States has managed to produce loyalty to its power on the ground across the globe. And these are not all consensual methods. To prevent recalcitrance from turning into revolution, the United States has consistently, from the beginning of the 20th century through to the present, relied on cops in its efforts to police the globe. And this project enrolled many of the most important police experts in their respective periods, figures whom the United States government shuttled across the globe and back. And in the process, the United States accomplished three outcomes. First, it increased the repressive capacity of its allies, proxies, and clients. Second, it increased the repressive capacities of its own law enforcement agencies at home. And third, it created new conditions of both constraint and possibility for social movements in many places. Now let me show you an image. Okay, great, that worked. Let me show you an image here that, if what I'm arguing is correct, this illustrates in some ways the essence of the global policeman role of the United States, the essence of US empire. And of course, this is a totally mundane image. What you see here is a car pulled off on the side of the road in South Vietnam, with 3 Vietnamese police officers searching it for contraband while a US police advisor looks on and gives advice about how to best conduct this search. This is a very common experience in US empire. After all, outside of World War I and World War II, the United States military actually engaged in extended combat operations in only a handful of countries in the 20th century, of course, including Vietnam. But the US sent police advisors just like this one to train local officers in practical methods of stop and search, like you see here, dozens of countries across the globe. And in some of those countries, these advisors stuck around for decades. So here's another image from the same series. This is a police advisor named Hirsch Miller with his Vietnamese counterpart, Ngo Van Cha. They're advising a Saigon police radio officer in the late 1950s. The radio equipment you can see was supplied, of course, by the United States. It was built according to US standards. And it was much like what you would find at the time in cities like Chicago or Baltimore. And Miller here, whom you see, first went overseas in 1957, beginning in Korea, and he then traveled the globe doing this kind of work in subsequent years in South Vietnam, Libya, Zaire, and perhaps a few other locations before he retired. Now, in general, when US police experts went overseas, they were doing this type of advising. They did not actually engage in police work. Their main task was to build new institutions and infrastructures, cultivate new dispositions and ideological adherence, and raise personnel competencies and technical capacities. In this sense, the work they accomplished was to depersonalize by creating long-lasting institutions, cultures, and technologies. And in this way, they left imprints on the state, both at home and abroad, that would outlast their individual careers and create linkages across disparate sites that they visited on their journeys around the globe. So there's a 3-part arc to this history that I'm analyzing, which begins with a relatively informal, ad hoc, and individual mechanism for the transfer of ideas and practices across borders. Second, there arose more formal centralized state infrastructure for those transfers. And third, there arose a hybrid public-private for-profit milieu for the transfers that was and remains to the present day highly decentralized. So I want to emphasize the second two periods here for purposes of time, but I'll just start briefly with the first period. Now, as you know, in 1898, the United States joined an effort against the Spanish colonial empire, and in a relatively short period of time, despite the political justifications for the effort, from the Caribbean to the Philippines, the United States had annexed new territories: Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. And erstwhile local allies in this fight against the Spanish Empire quickly recognized what was happening, and uninterested in accepting new forms of colonial rule and dominion, they then began to fight back against the US military and against local comprador power. All of a sudden, the United States was suddenly embroiled in a multi-continent counterinsurgency effort as guerrillas tried to defeat newly installed powers in the Philippines and in Cuba. And soon the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, all experienced US invasions, plus anti-colonial guerrilla warfare and US efforts to quell it. Now, what ended up happening is that these efforts to quell this guerrilla warfare initially took the form of US Army and Marines engaging in pacification directly, which meant both affording modest forms of economic development and brutally suppressing rebellion. But in addition to mounting pacification efforts itself, the US tried to build up local capacities in preventing insurgency. The United States created new police forces. These were called the Gendarmerie, the Constabulary, the Guardia Nacional, or simply the National Police. And generally, the Americans who created these forces were not police themselves, but they were soldiers. And as a result, the police forces they built were not quite the mirror image of US police forces, but instead blended military and police roles, often with long-lasting consequences for authoritarianism in these countries long after the United States withdrew. And there were stark results back home as well. A significant number of police chiefs across the United States who rose to prominence in the decades after the turn of the century had experienced fighting in places like the Philippines. And we don't know the exact number, but it's probably something like 40%, including major trend-setting cities like New York had high-ranking police leaders who had this warfighting experience. So this overseas warfare influenced policing in the United States early in the 20th century. These men learned a great deal about policing from counterinsurgency operations. For example, how to keep an intelligence data bank that would contain population statistics and crime statistics, as well as crucial identifying characteristics like fingerprints of suspects. The idea of creating telecommunication systems that would link dispersed police units to a centralized command. The idea of using geographic divisions of patrol. All of these drew on Army counterinsurgency methods, particularly in the Philippines. And even the concentrated data-driven approach to patrol across great distances using horses and bicycles and then eventually automobiles, this was arguably an inheritance of counterinsurgency warfare. Think about marksmanship, target practice, a focus on rigorous training for police officers in the use of firearms. This was a novelty that defined how to professionalize domestic policing in the United States after it had defined the professionalization of soldiers in the colonies. So the disciplined police officer on the beat in Los Angeles or Louisville was the progeny of the disciplined soldier or Marine in Luzon or Las Segovia. So let's think about this next period from World War II and after into the Cold War. Now, I'd argue the relinquishing of any firm barrier between police and military institutionally, personally, and geographically was the foundation of US global leadership after World War II on a globe that was emerging from the chaos of war. The process of US ascendance to global leadership depended on fluid transit across imperial and metropolitan spaces, foreign and domestic policy spheres, and military and civilian institutional bureaucratic domains. In the process, the organizing principle of the bureaucracies changed. After the war, the United States demanded that the defeated powers decentralize their policing operations, even as it centralized its own policing infrastructure. So right after the war, the United States occupied Germany, Japan, and some other places. And one of the major goals of the occupations was to prevent the rise of a new authoritarian power. The thinking at the time was that the soundest way to prevent that from happening was to liquidate the police forces as they had existed. Japan and Germany had centralized police forces, controlled at the national level by their respective dictators. So the United States, in contrast, maintained a highly decentralized police systems. And so the occupations tried to implement this sort of system in these countries to varying success. And they also, of course, introduced new policing technologies and techniques. Some of these were very simple, like handcuffs, which were rare in Japan before the occupation. But in addition to making sure that a recapitulation of the old forms of government did not occur, the occupations had another goal, which was to prevent the growth of left-wing power. And the person who was responsible for changes in Japan, like the introduction of handcuffs, as well as other technologies like tear gas, was a guy whose name was Byron Engel, and he's one of the primary figures I analyze in my book. He was among the most important figures for U.S. global policemanship. So Byron Engel joined the Kansas City police force at the end of the 1930s when the city itself was in a period of great upheaval. The long-standing political boss of the city had recently been removed, and a new reformist police chief, who was a student of J. Edgar Hoover, took over to lead the police force. Now, that new chief didn't last very long, but he brought in a whole new generation of police officers, including Engel. And Engel turned out to be something of a policing prodigy. He quickly rose up the ranks and established a reputation across the region as a talented police trainer who specialized in riot control. And at the end of World War II, he went to Japan to help oversee the Americanization of the police force. And he never looked back. He returned to Kansas City only to visit his mother and to work on recruiting officers from the region to follow him overseas. After several years working in Japan for the occupation government, where he introduced American-style decentralized police organization, as well as American-made technologies like I've mentioned, he eventually then became a CIA officer. And then he went to a totally different location, Turkey. And there he worked alongside the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the predecessor to the Drug Enforcement Administration. There, his work combined narcotics control with the control of communism. And he found that his local police that he was working with were much better at controlling communists than they were at controlling the opium harvest. And this was a pattern that repeated. So connections that Engel made in Turkey proved quite crucial for his career. In essence, Engel bridged every relevant agency of the Cold War. He had studied at the FBI Academy. He studied under J. Edgar Hoover and Hoover's student in Kansas City. He drew techniques that were the dominant lessons of key police leaders in the United States, like William H. Parker of the LAPD. He worked alongside agents of Hoover's chief rival, Harry Anslinger, who ran the Bureau of Narcotics, and he was now employed by the CIA and occasionally detailed to the Army. So he was at the bureaucratic center of the global policeman. He used this position to dramatically reconfigure pre-existing methods and to build new state bureaucracies. And whereas these other four men in this picture often couldn't stand to be in the same room as one another, Engel managed to maintain positive relationships with all of them, allowing him the room to pursue his primary objective, which of course they all agreed upon, which was preventing communist revolution in the so-called Third World. Engel excelled at making sure that the key figures in this picture found him non-threatening. And the best way to do that was to introduce techniques and ideas from each of them. And he suppressed his own identification with the methods so that he was building on rather than trampling the professional reputations of these figures. And in the process, he created something called the Office of Public Safety. So what was the Office of Public Safety, or OPS? OPS was the Foreign Police and Training Assistance arm of the US government, consolidated under the Agency for International Development, or AID, in 1962, when Kennedy was the president. Engel had already been supervising these efforts for a while, working for the CIA, but under Kennedy's leadership, OPS came into being as a centrally controlled operation with resources and room to grow, and Engel was its new director. So the Office of Public Safety offered technical assistance to 52 countries in the so-called Third World. And officers from those 52 countries, plus another 25 for a total of 77, attended its International Police Academy located in Washington, D.C. So basically on this map that you can see, you add 25 more countries to fill in a number of blank spots in Latin America, Africa, and Asia to get a sense of who sent police to be trained in the United States. Now, of course, it's obvious that some big countries were not included, China and the Soviet Union. India sent only about 20 officers from 1962 to 1972. Other big countries like Egypt and Algeria, they did not send any. Now, why was the United States so concerned with training police in the 1950s and 60s? The argument I make in Badges Without Borders is that the United States national security apparatus worried that the Cold War would turn hot in third world countries. Intelligence and national security officials felt that political loyalties were up for grabs, so to speak, in countries that were emerging from colonialism in Africa and Asia, as well as countries that were undergoing rapid economic and social transformations in Latin America. The idea was that loyalty could tilt to Moscow or Beijing, and of course after 1959 to Havana. And officials believed that the best way to assure that political revolutionaries, agitators, subversives, and guerrillas did not gain influence and potentially overthrow friendly governments was to bolster the police forces of these countries, both at the everyday patrol level and among more specialized and secret police. Byron Engel's belief was that the everyday techniques of fighting crime, based on what he called principles of good police management and good investigative techniques, these were what was necessary as the tools to fight subversion anywhere across the globe. The basis of the Office of Public Safety was that the principles of everyday policing were crucial to preventing communist revolution. So let's talk a little bit more about this International Police Academy that the Office of Public Safety opened in 1963 in Washington, D.C. You can see a picture of it. The building actually basically looks the same to this day, and it's now occupied by Georgetown University. So the International Police Academy invited police from East and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Africa, and it solved an American problem of global proportions. All of these folks with different skin colors, different cultures, different languages were to come together and learn a universal police science, which they would then bring back home with them and apply in the dual fight against communism and crime. Within the academy, these officers, some of whom would go on to be responsible, of course, for severe political repression, within the academy, they practiced cultural pluralism. They adopted almost an ideology that we would call liberal multiculturalism today. Police assistance itself was braided together with the community development programs of economic uplift that the Agency for International Development was supervising. But the Office of Public Safety contributed an aggressive and preemptive approach to political agitation and subversion, relying on the civilian police to do the job. So how did this work? There were three components. Training was the cheapest component. Training that took place in the International Police Academy concerned a wide range of expertise that police needed to learn, from forensics to riot control, traffic management to surveillance. And the two other facets included technical assistance, where the public safety advisors, as they were called, would help police in third world countries set up telecommunications, crime laboratories, prisons, and so forth. And the third was commodity assistance, where the United States supplied police in these countries with pistols, motorcycles, walkie-talkies, cameras, tear gas, and so forth. And all of this assistance was intended to make police, as the Office of Public Safety always said, into the first line of defense against crime and subversion. So the Cold War, I argue, was not only or even primarily a standoff between two nuclear-armed powers amid a frozen set of military installations in Europe. Instead, the Cold War was waged in the Third World, and it was often a war between US-assisted security forces, sometimes military, but often police, and a range of revolutionaries, workers, students, and peasants fighting for self-determination, political freedom, and economic independence. A key US premise was that to prevent the revolutionaries or guerrillas from advancing, the entire population needed to be made secure. So in practice, this meant the application of harsh policing and security methods, surveillance measures on regular people. In many cases, this would come to resemble the sort of zero tolerance policing practices that have been occurring in recent years in American cities like New York. The Office of Public Safety enrolled hundreds of experts in policing from around the United States and sent them across the globe to upgrade policing capabilities in many countries, reaching over 1 million foreign police in the process. Most of these countries emerged from this assistance with starkly improved repressive instruments, both better able to target individual political militants and better able to control populations more broadly. And many of these public safety advisors in turn came back to the United States with a reconfigured sense of what policing was supposed to do. And some did resume working in law enforcement around the country. Many of them, I would argue, returned with a sense of how crucial it was to use policing as a tool for both protecting and even legitimating often illegitimate regimes. And this proved important by the late 1960s in the United States, when, of course, many cities around the country were home to illegitimate regimes in the throes of rebellion by Black and brown populations against local white centers of power, whether the mayor's office or landlords or shopkeepers. Police were tasked with managing rebellion, and the Office of Public Safety devised techniques that they thought were less likely to prolong or incite protest, including technologies that have become commonplace, like the chemical CS or tear gas, which I talk about in one of the book's chapters. So at the very moment that the Office of Public Safety was at the height of its influence and its advisors were growing in prominence at home, social protest movement started to focus on it. And these mobilizations were part of the anti-war and anti-imperialist movements of the late 1960s, and they were actually quite successful. And this is how this process started. So in 1970, a congressional delegation went to Vietnam to study the status of the war, and they visited this former French colonial prison off the coast called Con Son. And this island prison was designed to hold almost 10,000 detainees, and what the delegation found was shocking. Malnourished women were confined in recessed concrete boxes measuring 5 by 9 feet. They had iron bars on the top, and they were called tiger cages. And from the catwalks between these cells, guards would toss chemicals like quicklime that burned the skin of the prisoners if they complained. Illness and disease were endemic, insects and lizards were rampant, and the delegation found detainees as young as 15 years old. South Vietnamese authorities operated this prison under OPS advisement. The U.S. advisor who was in charge was named Frank Walton, and he had previously been a high-ranking LAPD officer. When the delegation came, he said the inspection would find a facility that had better conditions than prisons at home. And that may actually have been true. But he quickly realized that allowing this delegation to visit the island was a mistake. And as soon as the delegation visited, he phoned his superiors and he said something terrible has happened, because he knew that they would reveal the conditions that they had seen. He even tried to argue that Congress had no business or authority over a South Vietnamese facility. Now, ultimately, the official trip report minimized the prison conditions. It rejected extensive descriptions of this U.S. Advised prison written by 2 members of Congress. And so a staffer became very angry at this whitewash and leaked the photographs that you can see here to Life magazine. So outrage started to mount rapidly. The war, of course, was already unpopular, but many people did not quite grasp that the war meant holding teenage girls in overcrowded prisons because they were suspected communists, and the US was overseeing this imprisonment. So street protests started to reference the tiger cages, as you can see here. People erected cages in Manhattan outside of the United Nations, and they would invite people to step inside these cages to experience the confinement. So this type of creative agitation, combined with focused lobbying of Congress, helped activists become successful in shutting down the Office of Public Safety. OPS ceased operations overseas in 1974 and ceased training police in Washington, D.C. in 75. This was a great accomplishment of the peace movement, but it did not completely shut down police assistance abroad. Instead, it opened the door to it taking on a new form. The state builders in Engel's cohort mostly retired or resigned from government service, but they did not disappear. When Congress legislated the US government could no longer offer police training overseas, the police trainers themselves decided that they would simply no longer work for the US government. The private security contracting firm adopted its contemporary form in this moment. Construction and logistics firms and security firms began to merger, and former public safety advisors were at the center of this combination. Now, Saudi Arabia to this day uses a single corporation to train its National Guard, which is a massive and deeply repressive force. And that corporation is called Vanel Arabia. It was founded in 1975 by former public safety advisors who worked for Byron Engel. They were already working in the kingdom, and when the Office of Public Safety was closed, they retired from US government employment, became private contractors, and started to earn a great deal of money. This shift to privatization was the key transformation beginning in the 1970s, and it marks the period that we live in up to the present. Although the US government eventually did get back into the business of training police overseas, first in the realm of narcotics control, the law that shuttered the Office of Public Safety is still on the books. So all of the efforts to assist police abroad that occur today must be accomplished through exceptions to the law. So what this means is that there is no centralized authority like the Office of Public Safety. Instead, it's a massive patchwork involving numerous agencies with no primary oversight, sometimes duplicating or contradicting missions, and oftentimes relying on the private sector. For example, corporations like DynCorp. At a cost of over $1 billion annually over 6 years, Washington paid DynCorp to train police in Afghanistan. And we could look at numerous other places where similar stories are true, where US police assistance through security corporations has affected conditions on the ground. Many times in countries where there have recently been stories about repressive policing tactics. Iraq, Colombia, Nigeria. These are just some of the places where there have been news stories in the past year that some of you may have been familiar with. In each case, police with US support and training have unjustifiably killed people, leading to protests. And then the protests in response have been met with extreme violence, oftentimes including police firing live rounds at protesters. And you can imagine Byron Engel rolling in his grave because the storyline is so familiar. It's what he would have encountered in the 1950s and 60s. Violent responses to protests are delegitimizing the government in Nigeria, for example, a major recipient of security aid from the US in terms of training and technologies. And this illustrates the paradox that Byron Engel himself could never quite resolve. On the one hand, upgrading police forces means equipping them with improved technologies and weapons. And the idea was always that police wouldn't have to use these weapons if populations were loyal and docile. But using these capacities for repression necessarily weakens the loyalty and docility of the population. So in thinking about the privatized and decentralized modality of global policemanship today, I think it's crucial to see its achievement as built on two pillars. First, it's fully depersonalized. Unlike the first era I've mentioned, where growth in state capacity was the function of the adoption of ideas of specific individuals, or the second era, where growth in state capacity was a function of the bureaucratic finesse of individuals like Engel, who attempted to depersonalize the global policeman. Today, we live in an era where depersonalization is the norm, to such a degree that no legislator takes ownership over the project, no State Department oversees the whole thing, no State Department agency oversees the whole thing, no CIA or national security official designates a strategy, and instead it kind of lumbers ahead semi-autonomously. There is no Byron Engel equivalent today. And this raises, I think, profound questions about how to change the situation in the future. The second pillar is that there is simply a lot of money at stake. When the operations occurred under government auspices in earlier decades, budgetary and legal impediments stood in the way of the amount of money becoming astronomical. But today, private security corporations have virtually unlimited resources at their own disposal through venture capital, and they're not always obligated to adhere to legal restrictions that government agencies must. And they can earn funding from a number of different sources. This is global policemanship today, oftentimes creating a seamless unity between police experts and capital. So to conclude, what I've suggested is that there's a relatively uninterrupted history of the cross-fertilization of US empire and policing since the beginning of the 20th century. The figures involved have changed, the laws governing it have changed, the institutions have changed, but the effect in many ways remains unchanged. What we see is a continued suppression of movements for freedom, continued racialization of populations through criminalization, and the continued growth of profits for corporations that have managed to get in on the action. What I think this analysis demands is that insofar as we develop critiques of police power in the United States, we must relinquish the implicit notion that police power in the United States is disconnected from US foreign policy and from the national security state and can only be challenged on local terrain. Instead, to transform the global policeman will require a global movement based on internationalism and solidarity across borders. I think we cannot allow internationalism and solidarity to be the province of global policemen alone. Thank you.
Stuart, thank you so much for your presentation, which I thought was excellent, and sort of just reflecting on that point that you raised towards the end of your presentation about this paradox of the means to suppress crime, subversion, whatever on the one hand, but actually then creating precisely that which it was intended to prevent. I'll take this opportunity to invite questions from the participants. If you could enter your questions into the chat box while we're waiting for some questions from you. Sort of just a couple of things I sort of was taking away from your presentation. I mean, sort of in the first instance, if you go back to at least the early Cold War period, the Eisenhower years and Kennedy and so forth, you can sort of see this policing being sort of a foreign policy tool that's sort of managed from a central authority, more or less. Then after, in this sort of middle, this period of the 70s, with the closure of OPS and so forth, and the privatization, it morphs into a business. And then especially after 9/11, it morphs into big business, and really takes on a life of its own. And I sort of recalling in your N+1 article, you discussing essentially this alphabet soup of different organizations, for example, that the State Department controls and all the different agencies. So I was sort of wondering if I could ask two questions related to this. The first one is, can you just sort of give us an overview of what the current apparatus is? I know it's sort of an empire more than perhaps an apparatus, but at least that which is sort of directly under the control or sort of working for the State Department and other relevant agencies. So can you sort of just give us an overview of that on the one hand? And secondly, you sort of talked about these efforts to reform the system in the 70s, and obviously failed. I mean, sort of had an impact, but then over the longer term it failed. Presumably the situation's that much harder to reform at this point, and you sort of mentioned a couple of things at the very end. We're talking about sort of a global approach. I was just wondering if you could sort of just explain a bit more about what you think is needed to reform the system. And do you think that there are going to be any sort of things that are not directly related to protest movements per se, but might have to do with, the COVID situation or some sort of external shock or variable that will have an impact on, say, the amount of money that's being spent on these police programs and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So in terms of trying to give an overview of what the bureaucratic landscape of U.S. police assistance looks like today, it's really quite a challenge. And the reason is that the Department of Defense and the Department of State both have authority to do this, and both have budgets to do this. But so too are involved, of course, the Department of Homeland Security, as you may know, Department of Homeland Security has just, it's new. It's less than 2 decades old, but it has just grown astronomically in size. And so now those are some of the biggest law enforcement agencies in the United States. And so a lot of the training that is being offered, particularly in Latin America, is in domains like border control and border policing. And so, CBP and ICE are doing that training, but that will be funded generally by the State Department, because the way that the budgetary authority for it works is very complicated. So, I think that this kind of leads to your second question of how to think about reining in the global policeman. I mean, I think that certainly there are human rights arguments to be made, and those essentially were the arguments that were made in the 1970s. I don't think that the argument has really changed very much, because the problem of human rights violations associated with other countries' security apparatus equipped and trained by the United States, that problem has not changed. There are some legislative controls in place today that did not exist in the 1970s on providing assistance to human rights violators, but they're generally they generally take effect kind of after the abuse occurs, rather than in a way that is designed to prevent them. Now, the training that the United States offers oftentimes will carry along with it, notions of professionalism, notions of respect for human rights. That rhetoric is widely present, but I think that when you look at the mission that agencies are being asked to undertake, again, preventing migration by people who are, really in many cases fleeing for their lives in places like Central America, it's very hard to see how the assistance that is trying to turn people around and send them back to countries they're fleeing from, how that can be in any way consistent with human rights protections. So, my overall argument, I think, would be that to the extent that there's going to continue to be this type of security assistance, particularly for policing, and it's primarily focused on counterterrorism and counter-narcotics, with counter-migration as in some ways the unifying factor and the actual practical effect, particularly in the Americas. I think that the one way to manipulate the legislation to make it better going forward would simply be to say that these programs have a finite time limit, and once they are done, they're done, and they should be directed toward not actually, in many ways, the way they're always described is building up partner capacity. And I would argue that actually they should be designed the opposite of constraining partner capacity, because actually the expansion of capacity is what leads to many of the violations. So I think it would require, it's in some ways perhaps an insurmountable challenge, but I think it would really require a complete 180-degree switch in how legislators and policymakers understand what the purpose of these programs actually is.
There's a question from Patricia, but before I get to that, if I could just quickly ask one follow-up to that. Sort of going back to, 60s, 70s, obviously with, even a film being made of the Mitrione affair, for example, sort of the U.S. taking a lot of heat in terms of its foreign policy because of those sorts of programs. I was wondering, sort of, how has that criticism evolved? Do you still see that same sort of criticism today of the sort that you saw in the Cold War? Or is that more, not really?
Yeah, I don't think that it I don't think that it takes on, of course, there's always criticism, but I don't think it quite takes on the same effect. In part because I think the United States has, the kind of political culture has become a lot less concerned about what the United States is doing overseas. I think this waxes and wanes to some degree, from season to season, but it's in many ways, I think a lot of Americans, particularly on the left, are, really struggling to try to sort out what they see as domestic problems, while leaving kind of foreign policy problems untouched. I think, that has been the case in part because the wars in Iraq, particularly Iraq, but also Afghanistan, were so unpopular. And yet they occurred anyway, that I think it just kind of left a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, and left people basically turning away from critiques of foreign policy. I think this has started to change in the last couple of years, and I also think that the protests of 2020, around policing, there was to my mind a somewhat surprising and quite impressive connection of some of these policing problems and injustices to U.S. foreign policy. So if anything, maybe there's an upswing of interest in what the U.S. is doing around the globe, but I think it just isn't nearly at the level that it was in the 1960s and 70s. And in part, I think it's because people, I don't want to generalize, but I think people are just kind of overwhelmed at all of the social problems that seem to need solving at home. And to, my response to that is simply to say that, like, we can't solve any of the at-home social problems without looking more broadly at U.S. foreign policy. And of course, COVID is the most, shining example of this. This is a global problem. Climate change, global problem. None of these can be solved, within any single nation's borders, and there needs to be much more cooperative approaches. The problem is that the United States has, for the past several, only thought of global cooperation in terms of these kind of security assistance programs, aimed at preventing terrorism, preventing narcotics, and of course, the evidence is quite clear that counter narcotics security assistance has just been an abysmal failure. It just has not worked. So there's good reason for rethinking and coming up with new approaches.
Yes, I was especially struck. I mean, if you go back to the 60s, for example, this whole question about development versus policing, and especially within AID itself with OPS. But I think more general, this whole issue about public relations is just not a very good image that the U.S. wants to, at least the U.S. government wants to project, but nevertheless it sort of engages with these sorts of activities. To ask Patricia's question, sorry for the delay there. Patricia asks, do these U.S. private corporations have competition? Do you know which is the Chinese strategy in that area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is some competition, and what's even more interesting perhaps is that some of these corporations are not even really U.S. corporations anymore. They're truly multinational, and they are in part becoming multinational or based outside the United States to escape scrutiny, to escape congressional scrutiny and other types of control. If it was the case that the very first corporations like Benel Arabia that I mentioned, became a private corporation to continue doing what these U.S. police trainers had been doing in the 1970s, and just get paid directly by the Saudi government and avoid the hassle of being U.S. government employees. The other benefit that went along with that is that U.S. Congress could have no say over what they were doing, and certainly there was no chance of any kind of Freedom of Information Act request revealing what was going on. And of course, it was through members of Congress gaining access to somewhat secret files and paperwork that is what led to the closure of OPS. So if it's purely private, it's a corporation that's not even chartered in the United States, well, then Congress can't really do anything about it, except perhaps just turn off the spigot of cash that goes into these corporations' budgets. But as far as corporate competition from other countries, in many ways, I would say, like perhaps that kind of competition could be the best thing for this overall picture. If other countries are offering approaches to human security that are less likely to lead to violence, then that might be seen as a kind of better product on the marketplace. And certainly it is the case that European countries are offering various types of law enforcement assistance that contrasts with the United States. And sometimes the United States is perfectly fine to let European countries, EU, and so forth, UN offer this types of assistance, and there are real dramatic differences. But when it comes to the fears of the U.S. losing its influence, or fears of a really dramatic security threat, then the United States will try to make sure that it maintains its primacy. So I don't know specifically about China, but I think that would be something that would be really great for an expert on China to investigate and other countries. What types of kind of products are these competitors offering in the realm of security assistance? As far as I can tell, the United States still reigns supreme when it comes to security assistance around the globe, both to police and military.
Just as a follow-up to that question, I mean, sort of going back to the 60s and 70s, I mean, this is sort of the era of decolonization, and you have lots of ex-colonial police officers from British Malaya, French Indochina, et cetera, sort of all over the place. And perhaps more recently, think about Israelis, South Africans, and so on. I mean, it seems like a very crowded market place in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1960s, when the Office of Public Safety was operating, the United States was pretty maybe jealous is the right word, very protective and territorial, and was suspicious of other countries that were trying to kind of, they saw as muscle in on their terrain. So although other countries did offer security assistance and police assistance then, the United States tried to kind of keep them at a distance, particularly when the United States felt like a given country was its most reliable ally. This started to change after the mid 1970s. Once the Office of Public Safety was closed, some other countries started to fill the vacuum. Germany, for example, was seen to have certain kind of counterterrorism expertise post Munich Olympics. And then, of course, yeah, countries like Israel and other countries that do this a lot today started to emerge as powerful players. So I think now the United States is less territorial, but there always is a little bit of territorialism, particularly I think in Latin America, because just long-standing histories of the Monroe Doctrine and so forth.
So I'd like to turn now to Lena's question. You mentioned a couple times in the course of your presentation the CIA, but Lena's asking about sort of the role of the CIA and policing since the 1970s. I think that's sort of like the first part of the question. What role did they actually have since then? And sort of a broader question as well. Your thoughts about, if I understand this correctly, sort of military police and their role. Or sorry, there's the military police division of responsibilities. Sort of where does the military end and the police begin, or vice versa?
Yeah,
perhaps.
Well, so on the CIA question, I can answer relatively quickly just by saying that I think we don't really know the full extent of this because the records are not available for after the 1970s. So it's an open research question that I hope scholars will continue to look into. During the Cold War, the CIA basically displaced the FBI and the Department of Justice from the scene, but then the Department of Justice and the FBI have kind of returned to the scene, and I think there remains kind of bureaucratic competition between CIA and FBI that I think would be interesting to look at. As far as the question of military and police, I mean, this is a kind of really fundamental question, and I'm afraid my answer will be a little bit unsatisfying, simply because I would say that how to draw a line between the two, it has been the persistent problem of this field over the course of the entire period that I've referenced from the beginning of the 20th century. I think that the blurriness has always existed, but it's probably become even stronger today, where now, particularly in counterterrorism operations as well as counter-narcotics operations, that the military is involved in them in many countries, both local militaries and the US military. But their missions are basically police-style missions. They're engaging in arrests, they are engaging in searches, they're following up on intelligence tips, and even to listen to the jargon of some military operators in this field. They will use terms like, I was listening to this talk the other day where this military special operations officer from the United States was saying, we policed up the suspect. That was the phrase he used, policed up, basically meaning arrested. So what that indicates to me, I think more generally, is just how difficult it is to draw a line between police and military. The military are engaging in police-style missions, and police on the streets of the United States, as well as around the country, including even in Spain, probably in Barcelona as we speak, the police are dressed in military-style gear. So that blurriness is really pervasive. I certainly wouldn't attribute it only to the influence of the United States, because it's happening in so many places, but it's quite strong for the United States today.
As a final question, Josh asks, and I might have to sort of change it around slightly, but he's sort of asking about how the U.S. went from sort of this sort of ad hoc individualist approach on the police advisors, sending them overseas and this sort of thing, to a more centralized approach during the Second World War, or perhaps just after the Second World War.
Yeah.
Sort of what was the motivation for this?
Yeah. Honestly, I'm not terribly sure that it was motivated in the sense that it was thought through. I think that the more I look at World War II, I realize that it really just radically transformed everything about the American state apparatus. Now, that's not to say that some of what it entailed wasn't already possible. Certainly, the New Deal was a program that was really about building up state capacity, but the New Deal, relied a lot on, locally instantiated agencies. World War II was much more of a centralized effort. And the effects of that were to leave a kind of centralized bureaucracy in its wake that in some sense was left open to be filled with new content. And the Cold War provided that new content. The centralized form could be pivoted away from the war effort toward the fight against communism and the national security state. I think that the individuals who who in the early part of the 20th century were responsible for the kind of ad hoc transfer of ideas, they tried to embed themselves in this kind of centralized bureaucracy. But if anything, I would just say that their experience before World War II of kind of more individualist approaches didn't suit them very well to the post-World War II bureaucratic state building. And I would just say, not that Byron Engel was necessarily some kind of unique genius, but he had the right type of disposition for this, which was really that he was a leader, but he really was concerned with building up a bureaucracy that would be able to accommodate the work that he wanted to accomplish, whether he was there or not. Ultimately, he disappeared from the scene basically at the very moment that the Office of Public Safety was closed down. So we don't really know what would have happened if he had retired and the Office of Public Safety had continued. But my suspicion is that all things being equal, it would have actually continued and grown if not for the protest movements against it, as well as some other kind of internal bureaucratic problems with the Nixon administration that are a somewhat separate question.
Just to Josh, I'm afraid Dr. Schrader is a bit modest, but he does actually have a new journal article. Is it out or is it coming out in Modern American History?
Yeah, it's coming out in the next couple months.
Right. So look out for this. It's entitled "Scaling Up Professionalization: How World War II Transformed U.S. Police," and that's in Modern American History. So now, as it's just past 7 p.m., I'm afraid we will need to bring this session to a close. Dr. Schrader, thank you so much for a superb presentation, which I found extremely informative and perhaps just a bit disturbing as well. In the course of your presentation, and I think after reading your N+1 article on Defund the Global Policeman, so there seemed to be some sort of distant echoes of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, except in this case, some sort of police complex. Because in many respects, their place in American society, and especially in U.S. foreign policy, seems to be quite secure despite efforts that have occurred from time to time to reform the system. And in fact, precisely because of how entrenched this sort of security assistance is in the system, it seems to beg the question, is change even possible, and under what circumstances? So that's one of my takeaways from your presentation. So thank you much indeed, and I'm certain you've definitely given all of us a lot to take away from your talk and to think about going ahead. Before leaving, I would like to just briefly remind everyone that the next session in this series will take place in 2 weeks on the 16th of March. Dr. Carlotta Encina from the Real Instituto Elcano in Madrid will be speaking on the topic of U.S.-Spanish relations and the Biden presidency. So I look forward to seeing you then and wishing you all a very pleasant evening. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. This has been great.